Well, the picture of the world, you might say, or the scheme for thinking about reality that Descartes leaves us with in his meditations. If we follow the story, there are actually 6 meditations, and Blackburn only really talks about the first 2 or 3, I think. But the scheme of reality, one might say, that Descartes leaves us with, the metaphysics, is that it is often called dualism, or even Cartesian dualism, named after Descartes. And that is the idea that there are two basic kinds of thing, and this is where the word, somewhat misleading word, substance is used. Two basic, utterly different kinds of things that make up reality. On the one hand, the physical, and on the other hand, the mental. What are mental things? Thoughts, sensations, feelings, perceptions. All the things that we have that sort of private relationship that we were talking about in the last video. And what is distinctive about those things, Descartes says, is that they are non-physical. They have no place. They don't happen in a certain location. They have no extension in space. They are real, however, they are not physical. And one may say that they are modifications of, or in some way or another, occurrences of, not occurrences of, but manifestations of mental substance. And substance really here means being. On the other hand, there are physical things, the objects that we take to be the constituents of nature. Everything from a planet to a cell, or any other physical thing, a chair, a car, a mountain. And what's distinctive about those things, Descartes says, is that they do not think. They are inert matter, one might say. They are made up of physical, non-mental substance. Descartes, in the history of philosophy, has gotten a lot of grief for this dualism, metaphysical dualism, this idea that there are two basic areas, you might say, of reality, the mental and the physical, and that they are utterly different from each other. That is, a mental occurrence, event, is utterly unlike a physical one. A mental thing, let's say like a mind, is utterly unlike a physical thing, like an apple or a human body, which would be a physical thing. He has gotten a lot of grief because this way of looking at reality does raise some problems, some really deep problems. But I don't think it's a crazy way of describing our intuitive sense of reality. That there are thoughts on the one hand, and there are things or physical things on the other, and that they are utterly different from each other. But one of the problems that's raised by this dualism, let's call it the substance dualism, the idea that there are two utterly different kinds of thing, the mental on the one hand, the physical on the other, in the universe. The problem that Blackburn focuses on in this chapter, first of all, is a very real problem that emerges from this metaphysics, or this metaphysical framework, and that is, how could the mental and the physical possibly interact? That is, we have a notion that one thought can follow another, and so in one way or another, thoughts can affect each other or have causal relations with each other. We certainly are familiar with the idea that one physical thing or one physical event can cause another physical event. That's what science tries to establish. But we have utterly sort of no idea, and it may be completely incoherent to think that a mental event can cause a physical one, or that a physical event can cause a mental one. Remember, if they are utterly different from each other, how could they relate in the proper way to have some kind of interaction? This is the problem of mind-body interaction. It would seem on Cartesian dualism, this metaphysical dualism, that such interaction would be impossible, and perhaps it is. But why is this a problem? Well, the problem is us, in the sense that that kind of mind-body interaction is the most familiar thing we can possibly think of. That is, we ourselves, as human beings, are presumably both mind and body. We have minds in the sense that we have a subjective experience, we have feelings and thoughts and sensations and perceptions. And on the other hand, we are bodies that are in causal connection, certain causal connections with the world, and the parts of our bodies are in causal connections with each other, obviously. And that causation obviously goes both ways. Some examples here. If I think of an embarrassing incident in my past, that is, which would be a purely subjective mental event, oftentimes I blush, which is a physical event happening in my body. It would seem that the mental causes the physical. The other way around is even more familiar to us. The example of the pinprick. If a physical event like a pin piercing my finger happens, then a mental event, my subjective experience of pain, occurs. So on the one hand, the picture that we get from dualism, that there are these two utterly different types of thing called substances, mental substance or mind on the one hand, and physical substance on the other, that they're so different from each other that they exist in utterly different ways, so they couldn't possibly relate to each other in any kind of direct way. That clashes with our own common sense, I would say, experience and belief that that kind of interaction between the mental and the physical happens all the time. It's the most common thing in the world. Problem is that we have no way of explaining it, right? And this is to some extent the controversy that Blackburn reviews between the philosopher Locke, great 17th century English philosopher, and the philosopher Leibniz, I believe, great 17th century German philosopher. Forgive me if my dates are wrong, but I believe that that's true. Is that they had different theories of how to think about mind, mental event, the relation between mental events and physical events. Clearly, Locke believed that you couldn't think of physical events as causing mental events. That is, you couldn't think of the pin piercing the fingertip as being the cause of the experienced pain. That is, that they both obviously happen, but in this sort of complicated way, it seems like we have to bring in God. That is, that there's no causal relation between the two events, because that would be impossible, because the physical and the mental can't have that kind of connection to each other. The idea is that God made the universe in such a way that when the finger is pierced by the pin, that a certain experience occurs in the mental realm. But that's at God's pleasure. It's not the way the universe has to be because of some physical or psychophysical laws of nature. Leibniz seemed to disagree, and although what I've read in Blackburn doesn't go so far as to make a causal connection between the physical and the mental, he certainly says that the mental event or the mental experience, let's say, of pain, is entirely due to the physical events. That is, that although these things are utterly different from each other, we can relate them in some way. And he gives an analogy of how different figures like a circle can be related in certain rational ways to other figures like ellipses. That is, because an ellipse can be thought of as kind of a squashed circle, that the original circle you can sort of see how the circle and the ellipse are related, that every point on the circle, for instance, can be corresponds to a point on the ellipse. Think of an ellipse as just kind of like a ovally shape. That the mental and the physical could be related like that. That is, that everything in the mental event of feeling pain in a particular way can be related to something in the physical event of the finger being pierced by the pin, and that we could think of the mental event as an expression in some way of that physical event. The way that we could think of, say, an ellipse of a certain nature being an expression of, different from, but an expression of a certain circle that it corresponds to in certain ways. That's a very interesting idea, but you can see what the problem is. And really, that's much more important than seeing the philosopher's proposed solution in many cases, is just understanding what the problem is. And the problem is, and I think what Blackburn really wants to get across in the first part of this chapter, the problem is, how do we account for mind-body interaction in a metaphysical framework of dualism? It's very difficult. And it's clear that at certain points, Blackburn is suggesting that it's so difficult and it raises so many problems that we should get rid of it, that we should get rid of the idea of dualism, and many philosophers have tried. And what are the alternatives to dualism? There certainly are some, but as in the history of philosophy so often happens, you replace one problematic theory with another problematic theory. So we'll